for the invitation to speak at this conference. I've learned so much over the last day and a half. And I'm not exactly sure what a keynote is. Anyway, but you will hear my thoughts about this title, sort of equity and new mobilities, possibilities, and pitfalls. And just to let you know my background, so I come to the world of transportation from my interest in doing work on poverty and low-wage labor markets. And so I have learned transportation as a derived demand. I'm going to start talking like the transportation planners, as a derived demand, and am very interested in the role of transportation in accessing opportunities, but also producing the kinds of equity outcomes that we've been talking about for the last couple days. So I'm going to start by just laying my cards out on the table. I'm going to make three sort of arguments here. This is not a research talk, so I haven't presented it quite like that, and I've not done a lot of my own empirical research on new mobilities. Okay, so just lay that out there as well. But I am going to draw my own research, and also I set off my slides last night, so some thinking about all of the presentations that were made as part of this sort of workshop so far. So first, I don't think technology is inherently good or bad. I would say, sort of in and of itself. And I really think that the equity issues that we're concerned about, that I'm concerned about, really arise in how we are thinking and deploying the technology, which also puts a lot of burden on us, both as academics and also as planners. I think I said this maybe in my small group yesterday. I'm particularly worried that the kinds of changes that we're experiencing in our metropolitan areas, that those without automobiles are increasingly disadvantaged. So you can all guess how I voted last night after the debate. It's not a mystery. And I think, like others have said at this conference, I think new transportation mobility services certainly may perpetuate inequality if we don't intervene in some way. But I think, and maybe this is my own coming to terms with myself in a very complicated era, so I'm really going to try to think positively in this talk, but I think that they offer some sort of promising sort of opportunities, and the jury is still out. I think that a lot of things are new. Okay, so what I want to do, and I'm also going to go through some of these slides pretty quickly based on some of the talks this morning. I want to talk just a little bit about technology and transportation disruptions, a bit historically with a positive spin. I want to talk about access disparities. We've already talked about that, but I'm going to present some numbers just as sort of laying the context for where I see the possibilities, since that's the title I came up with for this talk 6 months ago or whatever. And then I want to end by talking about sort of pitfalls and opportunities. Okay, so disruptive changes in the transportation sector, first of all, are not new, and I'm actually stealing, anyone went to one of our Lake Arrowhead conferences, I'm going to steal from Marty Wax a little bit on a couple pictures, and historically, I think, have played important roles in the pursuit of equity outcomes. So I know we've talked a lot about disparities, I'm going to talk about that too, but they're also positive examples sort of as well. Okay, and someone mentioned this, I think, yesterday, right? So cycling, so the velocipede, okay? So bicycles were used as part of the suffrage movement, okay? So in terms of we're using words, in terms of freedom, access to organizing opportunities. And so the statement on the right, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are credited with declaring that women is riding suffrage on the bicycle. So great sort of quote. These look oddly familiar, okay? So this is the Autoped. I think that's how it's pronounced, I'm assuming, okay? So 1916. So the Autoped, as you know, again, as we talked a lot about scooters, they took off in 1916 in New York during the streetcar strike. Okay, and so folks are looking for ways to get around, not on the streetcars, and so scooters were one of the ways that they did that. I think we often talk about at least it's mentioned, I've heard it, other people mention it, talking about car sharing as part of the civil rights movement. And so I've kind of highlighted, church-operated station wagons known as rolling churches met people at designated pickup points. Black-owned taxis and private cars were quickly organized into a system of alternate transportation. So they were part and parcel of the civil rights movement, and those are sort of images of the Montgomery bus boycott. So there is a whole history of car sharing, not just as part of the civil rights movement as well. And so this is a whole montage. Did you know there are a lot of songs apparently about jitneys? Okay, so I learned that. So those are all the sheet music about sort of jitneys. But car sharing started as private vehicles, people using their private vehicles to carry people around. They were certainly used during World War II, save gas, save money. Okay, so some of the same sorts of themes. And then there's a long history of riteros. So in agricultural communities, car sharing, okay, riteros, people driving other people around, largely farm workers, to get to work sites. And I just heard an interesting talk about that tradition in California's Central Valley, in the city of Huron. So some examples there. So previous technological changes in the transportation sector have, I think, like a lot of what we've seen, they've been associated both with opportunities and also with inequities. And so I'm trying to be optimistic. So I'm trying to focus on the opportunities here. So sort of based on these examples, and there are many more, we see these kinds of transportation sort of services or disruptions at the time associated with freedom, right? So moving around the city, accessibility, sort of access to destinations, reduced costs in the form of, sort of saving gas, political organizing, so suffrage, civil rights. I should have added labor, right? So, labor organizing, as well as jobs, right? So driving people around, we talk about, all the controversies around Uber and Lyft and drivers and taxi drivers and all of that. But riteros were being paid for shuttling people around as well. Okay, and so the list here are all the things that we've been talking about, right? There's lots of costs associated sort of as well, and I don't want to neglect that. So clearly unequal access to services across neighborhoods, across different population groups, unequal exposure to burdens, so we can sort of think about safety, and many of you were talking about safety, and there's certainly many environmental consequences as well. And I actually think we're not talking quite enough about sprawl. Right, so if we think about the history of sort of transportation, the evolution of transportation technology, I think that it is clearly associated with sprawl and sort of this vicious cycle in terms of needing an automobile to access sort of opportunities. Okay, so transportation inequity. So there are lots of inequities, and we've talked about sort of many of them over the last day and a half. I already said the one that keeps me up at night is this one. So the fact that this accessibility gap is growing over time, increasingly disadvantaging those who are involuntarily carless. And I'm very concerned about that. I mean, I know, I teach in planning, students are talking about, sort of young white folks moving back into central city neighborhoods, gentrifying those neighborhoods, pushing, so we all know that story. Sort of overall, I think that there really is this, we're not keeping up, right? There's still this sort of widening disparities with respect to access to opportunities, and I'm deeply concerned sort of about that. And again, like others have said, I don't think this is rocket science. This should not come as any surprise because we've created cities around the automobile, right? And then we kind of act like we're surprised when we find a huge list of studies, by the way, that show the relationship between having a car and a whole variety of outcomes. And so, you know, Mike and Nick talked about their work, but there's a whole long list, not just planners, but economists. Lots of people have looked at this question, okay? But it shouldn't be a surprise because those are the kinds of cities that we have built. Whatever. Okay, so, all right. So just a little bit of data. I'm not going to, no models, no accessibility measures. I mean, just some basic data. It is important to note that most people get around in cars, even low-income travelers, even seniors, even those with disabilities. I don't have all those on my graph. You'll see in a minute. But that's the dominant mode of travel. Now, certainly, some groups are more likely to use transit, for example, or walk than others. That's true too. But the dominant mode of travel is travel by automobile. Oh, and the data, I'm sorry, is going to be U.S. focused.
It's true in Canada.
I'm sorry. Okay, good. Thank you. I'm hoping there's some relevance here. Okay. These are just data from the recent National Household Travel Survey, just to give you an idea. Here, low income is below $25,000 US dollars, about the bottom income quintile. And then you can see sort of what this is for the major sort of racial and ethnic groups. In hindsight, I should have put seniors on there and those with disabilities, but I didn't. Okay. So the second is the sort of large accessibility gap between cars and public transit, and that's how we started the conference, right? So we started by talking sort of about that in most neighborhoods, and I had a whole bunch of slides, but I've cut it down to this. So these are, you know, the big metropolitan areas in the U.S. that have reasonable transit, okay? And so at best, you can see on the left is the New York metro area, and still you can reach, and I picked, you know, this is 60 minutes by travel, thanks to the folks at the University of Minnesota as well. But still, best case scenario, you can, 4 times as many jobs by automobile than by public transit. If you live in the metropolitan area where I am from, it's 13 times. In fact, in Los Angeles, in the LA metropolitan area, there is not a single neighborhood where you can reach more jobs by transit or walking or biking than you can by automobile, despite congestion. Okay, so low income and African American households are significantly less likely to have cars than higher income and white households. And so again, sort of drawing on the data from the National Household Travel Survey, you could see that here. So there are significant sort of racial and ethnic differences that are extremely important. Okay. And that the accessibility gap is growing over time, increasingly disadvantaging those who are involuntary carless, and I've now said that three times. There's a lot of images that you can present here. I think that the one that seems, I mean, just the idea that seems the most complicated, even for, my students, is that things are, I've been doing some work in the San Francisco Bay Area on this, so things are concentrating, people, low-income households, as well as jobs are concentrating in central cities. So those trends are happening, right? So in the Bay Area, there are more jobs in job centers now than there were sort of 10 years ago. But there's a lot of action that's happening on the urban periphery. So over time, in the urban periphery, things are becoming much more spatially dispersed. So both of those things are happening at the very same time, agglomeration and dispersion. And so what you see here on the left is just looking at what we've talked about already, the suburbanization of poverty. And so now in metropolitan areas in the US, more than half of poor families now live in the suburbs, and there's a good deal of diversity in what those suburbs look like, of course. And then you see that even though lots of job concentration, right, in and around central business districts, okay, so lots of jobs there, right, that's the biggest concentration, but most jobs are dispersed around the region, many of them outside of job centers, even if those job centers are located in the suburbs. And so it's important to understand both of those things because they have different implications for transportation, right, and accessibility, of course. Okay, and so this is from this sort of builds on work that the Brookings Institution has done. It'd be great to have these updated, but this looks at decline in job sort of proximity from 2000 to 2012, and you can see that the biggest decline is among various racial and ethnic groups and among the poor. Okay. So, and it's a reflection of these changes that we're seeing in metropolitan areas. Okay, so I'm going to skip over these slides because the last two panels have already done this. I just want to note, I was just cutting and pasting here. There's a lot of work that's been done sort of thinking about new mobility, right? And so these are some of the reports and publications. So it is definitely sort of evolving, including some of the studies that were presented here as well. So there's lots of pitfalls. There's no question about that. I agree. And, you know, the panelists kind of went through these, okay? And so I'm not going to, right? So the financial barriers, the access barriers, there's psychological barriers. I was just talking in the bus about, I have my mother still alive in her mid-80s, and she lives in what is technically in Los Angeles, a central city, but really it's a suburb, right? So in 1950s suburb, she lives close to a bus stop that doesn't take her anywhere, and she has basically said her life is going to come to an end if she can't drive that car. I said, no, there's other alternatives. Let me show you how to, do Lyft or, do Uber. And we put it, she does have an iPhone, okay, and we put it on her phone. How many times do you think my mother has used Uber or Lyft? 0. Yeah, less than 1, exactly, right. So there are barriers. She has the phone, right? So, and I know that scholars are working on this question as well, okay? So there are certainly sort of psychological sort of barriers as well. And we talked about the effect on transit service. And sprawl, I'm going to keep on coming back, right? So thinking about their role in the continued dispersion of cities and that whole cycle. So those are all true, okay? So I don't want to discount that. So I just want to kind of talk about what, given sort of those patterns that we see, what some of the possibilities are, and then it really is kind of a random sample of 3 different examples that I will talk about. First, I think, and others I think agree, because a couple of you have said this, I really think that the success of the new non-automobile modes, so things like bike share and scooters, and the success of public transit. I'm going to come back to public transit because we've been doing a lot of work on that at UCLA, sort of public transit ridership trends. It is fundamentally going to be based on our willingness and ability to have drivers pay for the use of the roads. Okay, and I don't see another way sort of around this. So again, random sample, there are so many ways that we privilege the automobile, right? So these are some examples. Certainly the one on the right, comes from hanging around my colleague Donald Shoup, who's talked a lot about paying for parking. Just last year, David Levinson was at UCLA, gave a great talk. The picture on the bottom left, just thinking about pedestrians and how we privilege automobiles. We have done so much. Housing, people talked about housing, right? So the minimum parking requirements play a role in terms of affordable affordable housing. There's so much that we've done to privilege the automobile. And so I think that, I had mentioned that, we've been doing a lot of this work on public transit ridership. There's been, despite investments in transit, so I'll talk about Southern California. We're doing the work in the Bay Area right now as well. Despite these investments, transit ridership is down. And actually the decline, just to hit on the Uber Lyft thing, the ride-hailing, TNCs, whatever we're calling them now, that the decline preceded the entrance of the ride-hailing sort of firms. And it's a real concern, right? And so, and the agencies, and I actually think that the agencies in LA have really great leadership at the moment, and they're really trying to creatively think about how to address this issue. And I think that transit agencies get blamed a lot. It's like, what are you doing? Why aren't you picking up those riders? Why is ridership down? And I really think that, and lots of other studies have suggested this as well, is that it's what's outside of the control of transit agencies that is driving the issues facing sort of Los Angeles and transit. And they're moving in that direction too, I will say, but that's another story. That's another talk. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I think that the headline is that we have to do more than offer carrots, fancy new service, fancy new bikes, fancy new, whatever the fancy new thing is, we're going to have to do more to get people to change their behavior. And I think it starts with changing the way that we privilege the automobile. Okay, so enough on that. But until we do that, I'm going to come back to this whole debate we had last night. But until we do that, I fundamentally believe that cars just have to be a part of the mix. Otherwise, we're destining a lot of families to very limited access to opportunities and outcomes. I just want to remind everybody, so I'm going to, I teach in a planning program. I live close to a rail station. I use transit. I like biking. I've scootered. I've done it all, okay? And those are all, I think they all can play a role. So the debate last night was a little troubling because it's, is it car and, or transit? And I think that both of those things are important, but we need to think about the ways in which we plan to make sure that we have some kind of an integrated system. But until we do that, we got a lot of folks living in areas where there is no way that those other modes are going to give them access to the opportunities that they need. So I hope, maybe I should have said, I hope that some of these new mobility options can help. Okay, and I kind of feel like we have a responsibility, or planners have a responsibility to figure them out because they're here. I don't know about the autonomous vehicles. I'm less clear on because they're not so present in our cities yet. So I don't know what to make of them, and I'm not an expert in autonomous vehicles, but I certainly see scooters, and I certainly see bikes, and I certainly see velopeds, right. Autoped, veloped, okay. So, all right, so I'm just gonna do two, check me on my time, please, but I'm almost 10, okay, perfect, all right. So I just want to talk through what some of the possibilities conceptually might be, and then, like I said, just give just a few examples that I've been peripherally involved in. So I think that you notice the header here is just thinking about some of these car-based services, right? So that's what I've kind of narrowed down to here. So I think, and maybe I hope, that they can be used to reach destinations that are not accessible by alternative modes. We talk a lot about employment. I'm increasingly interested in issues related to school choice. So there's been certainly a growing trend, even within, forget about public-private, but even within public schools, around schools and their location. And that's particularly important. And there are some folks, mostly in education, less in planning, doing work on transportation related to high quality, not related to walking to school, but related to access to high quality education. I think that is sort of important. So these services can play a role in underserved neighborhoods. So I know, there's discussion about ride hailing and taxi and competition, but, taxi services had a long history of discriminating against minority neighborhoods. So we got to remember, what are we comparing this stuff to, okay? And so I think we need to remember that. And before we had Uber and Lyft, people were talking about how low-income neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods were underserved by taxi service, and certainly sort of transit sort of deserts. They hopefully, and I think some of the evidence maybe presented this morning is suggestive of this too, is that they can sort of help with trip purposes that are difficult to do by other modes. So shopping may be one where you're carrying a lot of things. You don't tend to go, do you have Costco in? Okay, you don't tend to go to Costco with the big shrink wrapped whatevers and carry it on your bike, right? Or what? You only do, okay. I have a feeling, well, you know what, there's another paper about people thinking that other people do as the planners do. Kelsey Ralph's paper, which I think is very good. Most people are going to be taking if you're buying a lot of toilet paper. I clearly shop at Costco. Okay, all right. So if you're carrying a lot of toilet paper, it's hard to do it on a bike. But let me get off the shopping thing. So there is, and Lyft has kind of responded to this recently. I don't know how well it's going to work, but there is a whole thing about job search. So we did a transportation needs assessment. I'm going to date myself, post-welfare reform during the Clinton administration. So in the late 1990s when I started working on these kinds of issues, and we actually did a survey in Los Angeles and in Fresno, in California's Central Valley, to look at how recipients were traveling around. And the biggest obstacle, actually, their transportation obstacle related to the job search, not actually traveling to work. So once they figured out where the job was, they can figure out, a way to use transit to get there. But, the welfare program was saying, you got to apply to X number of jobs, right? And they had difficulty doing that without a vehicle. So what they wound up doing, I'll just tell you how they worked around it, because they would not get their benefits if they didn't say they applied for X number of jobs, is they'd go to a shopping mall, whether or not that they could actually get a reasonable job, and they'd go and fill out applications, because that was the way to meet the requirements of the welfare program. So having a car and access to a car was important for that. I don't have anything on the right here, but a number of people were talking about not only being a zero vehicle household, but being an auto deficit household. And so there are a lot of households where that's the case. So if someone's using the car, it is helpful to have sort of a backup option occasionally. And I think potentially these kinds of services can lower the cost of automobility. We talked a little bit about costs and the cost burden. The one advantage of things like car sharing and ride hailing is that you only have to, in theory, pay for the automobility that you actually use. Low-income travelers take fewer trips, travel shorter distances. The evidence and there has been a lot of evidence on pay-per-mile auto insurance, right? And so what the equity benefits are for, rather than paying some kind of a flat fee, that you pay per mile, and the economic benefits to low-income households can be great. The environmental one, and I'm going to come back to this, is, it really is, we looked at these sort of old vehicles that low-income households had, and they are concentrated in low-income neighborhoods, so they lead to environmental justice issues. And so if we can replace those with cleaner fuel vehicles, I think we could do more in this area, and California is doing more, and I'll talk about it. Okay, so let me just end with three quick sort of examples, and then I'm done. Nick mentioned this program, and none of these, I'm just telling you, they're still working out the details. So there's some, I've been involved in one study related to this program. So there are a lot of kinks to be worked out, right? So I'm just talking about promises here, okay? This is the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. It's funded with cap and trade funds through the California Air sort of Resource Board. It offers rebates for the purchase or lease of a cleaner fuel vehicle, and there's particular incentives that are targeted to low and moderate income sort of households. The potential benefits is you try to retire these gross polluting sort of vehicles. You replace them with newer, cleaner fuel vehicles that are more fuel efficient, so that should reduce your costs. And hopefully, in my mind, since I already told you what my interests are, sort of more reliable sort of vehicles sort of as well. And so they're still tinkering with that program, trying right now, I think it is helping more on the moderate income households rather than the lower. So there's a lot of work and to be done there, but it is a possibility. Okay. I have a student working on this. Someone mentioned the Canadian version of this. So this is Hop, Skip, and Drive. It is, one of these platforms to provide children with safe, dependable way to get them to where they need to be. So schools, and actually schools are contracting with Hop, Skip, and Drive as well. So coming back to my comment about school choice, maybe helping parents with that. But they have a contract, Hops, at least in Los Angeles, have a contract basically to provide school care to foster kids. So every time they're moved around, they don't have to move schools, so they can stay in the same schools. So there's lots of creative things that can be done here, and I think the school piece is important. And then back, I guess I was thinking, did I put a hyphen or did I not put a hyphen? Apparently not. Okay, I have no idea, but okay, so we know what ride-hailing sort of is. I think that, and here, I was on Anne Brown's work was referred to a number of times, and so she did great work on this. So there is huge demand for ride-hailing in low-income neighborhoods, particularly the shared service. And again, maybe not for sort of all trips, but certainly for some. And I think maybe could be helpful. I just told you the big issue about sort of job search, and Lyft has picked that up recently to think about providing free job search. And yes, they want someone to work and use their services, right? I mean, it's a business model, but it may sort of help low income, low wage workers sort of find jobs, not just travel to them. Okay, so my last comments. This is my last slide. Just reflecting on sort of a couple of things that people have talked about. I'm going to return to the debate. And in some ways, I think that the question was set up in not the best way. And maybe Orly picked up on this. So it was the burden of the pro-car team to talk about how cars can really help low-income families. And I think we have a similar burden on the other modes. Why is it that we have to say, oh, it's here's the 30th study that shows that cars improve employment outcomes, right? But it's the burden on the other side to say, look, this is how public transit can help achieve the outcomes that we're interested in. And for low-income households, I mean, I care about environmental quality, but if we're talking about low-income households, we also have to think about sort of outcomes for low-income sort of households. So that's one thought. The second thought is that things aren't currently equitable. Right? We're not starting anew. I think if we were starting anew, we would do things, at least the folks in this room would do things differently. So, we're not. And so we've got to kind of think about these new opportunities with respect to existing sort of inequalities. And I think sometimes we forget to do this. Two more points. I'm done. So I think the third, and maybe this came back to the discussion about our measures that we had, and I was in the activity participation group, and I've done work on access, and I think access is, despite how we log some or other, I think access is very important. But I think as part of the mix, and I think folks in this room are already doing this, that we really have to think about these sorts of programs that I mentioned and evaluate them to see whether, in fact, they're producing outcomes for low-income families, that they are actually of benefit. And I think that that's important. And I think ultimately, the devil is in the details, right? So I've kind of just talked about things conceptually. I think that technology is technology, and if we're going to link technology with with equity outcomes, we need to be very careful and deliberate in the work that we do. Otherwise, I agree. We're just going to continually sort of repeat the kinds of transportation inequities that we've seen historically. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Three minutes.
Okay.
Well, let's hear from a few people then, and then we'll have Evelyn decide. I will ask the first question.
Oh, dear.
No. Well, what should the motion have been?
Oh.
No, because that's not my real question. No, my real question is, well, it might be okay. My real question is, I'm curious about this job search difficulty. And, I mean, so I'm thinking about our region here, which has quite a rational transit system. It's grid-based. You more or less need to go east for a while and then south for a while, and there's going to be buses that go in those directions. So is it actually difficult to? What's the source of difficulty in taking transit to a job interview?
It's not. It's not actually taking transit to a job interview that is the problem. It is taking transit to multiple destinations. So, and that relates, so job search is one way, right? So, so welfare participants would, they'd have this day where they needed to go, and they would, I said sort of go to the shopping mall. But it's also true, we've not talked enough about women and their travel patterns, right? So it's harder for them. All the trip chaining makes it extremely, not in all, if you live in a super dense urban environment and you have figured out, you have the luxury to figure out that you have all your sort of origins and destinations in reasonable proximity. So most people don't live and work in this, we've tested this, live and work in the same neighborhood anyway, but close, then transit and walking and all those things might work. But most people's lives are not like that. And so the multiple trips, and women tend to be doing that, the trip chaining, that gets more difficult. And so job search is a piece of that. That's right. Multiple trips, yeah. So it's not a single destination. So in fact, that survey, and it was done a long time ago, showed that the barriers, we asked them about their different travels, so the barriers went down once they found a job, because then they could figure out how to get there on transit, right?
And
so the big barrier.
And the rest of their schedule adapts in order to make that
yes.
accommodate whatever the commute needs.
Yeah, so they were able to make, it may not have been easy, but they were able to make those adjustments. But the job search was particularly difficult.
Okay.
So.
Thank you. We really, unfortunately, don't have much time, so we'll do Adam and who's going to have the next question? We'll do both at the same time. And Carl, excellent.
Thanks, Evelyn. That was a great presentation. So, quick question for you. So I want to talk about an automated context for a minute. The built environment of the suburbs is pretty well set. So do you think we can kind of repurpose the suburbs? And if not, what does that mean for automated vehicles?
Internalize.
Okay, internalize. Repurpose suburbs. Yes.
I want to push back a little bit against your proposition to compare programs to give poor families a car and compare in the same way public transport investment. So I did vote yesterday in favor of the car programs. And I also faked the voting a bit because I voted first for the other program, knowing that I would move to the other one.
It's a little bit of game theory.
Yeah, I'm just joining the American tradition of elections. Anyway, I think that public transport investments have a network effect, which cars don't have. If we give a car to a poor family, it will only benefit that family and maybe some people around it. Investing in public transport will have a tremendous network effect, which is very difficult to measure. It's very spread out. And so it's really an investment in a very different urban system. And so these are not two things you should compare to each other. It's two things you have to do in parallel. And there's plenty of money to do this the moment you realize that congestion is not a transport problem. And so you can do both. You can make the short-term programs to help people now and invest in their freedom for the future by investing in transit and social housing.
So
It's not really a question, but
yeah,
you probably have a good response.
You know what? Okay, so I'm actually going to link those two together, and so I don't disagree with you. And in fact, we're doing that. I mean, you know what I mean? So in California, I mean, I just said, we have this auto program, and there's gigantic investments in public transit, certainly in Southern California. So I don't disagree with you. But I think that, you know, sort of maybe going back to this issue of the suburbs, I think that our land use will change, and I need your language, but the benefits of this whole network investment in transit when we stop privileging the automobile, okay? And then it's a change. So back to the suburbs, I don't think things are going to change things aren't going to change overnight. No way, you know, and I've not always lived in Los Angeles, but actually grew up in Los Angeles, and things are different than they were when, you know, I was a kid. So things are moving slowly and not as fast as I would want or we need. But I think that if we change, and it's politically difficult. It's much easier to say, if we vote for this, you know, piece of legislation, right? If we will vote to tax ourselves, like we did in Los Angeles, to improve public transit, we're going to solve congestion, which is not going to happen, okay? Just telling you right now, it's not. No, I don't think any transportation academic in Southern California would agree with that. So it is much easier to do that than it is to tackle the much thornier question, because most people are you look at the ballot box, most people are getting around using a car. You're saying, I'm sorry, you had this thing for free, and now we're gonna charge you. But I think that all the development stuff, not immediately, is going to completely change if we think about, you know, sort of adjusting the ways in which we privilege the automobile. Huge payoffs all around, and for equity. So that's it.
Wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.